In 1941, the world held its breath. The Axis powers, a new and terrible force, seemed invincible. From the cockpit of a Messerschmitt screaming over the English Channel, to the conning tower of a U-boat in the Black Atlantic, to the turret of a panzer tank rolling into the endless Soviet steppe, the Axis war machine was a marvel of speed, terror, and brutal efficiency. Adolf Hitler, a man who just years earlier was a failed artist, was now the undisputed master of Europe. His armies had crushed Poland, humiliated France, and driven the British into the sea. He stood for photographs at the Eiffel Tower while his architects planned a new, colossal Berlin to be the capital of the world. In the Pacific, the Empire of Japan, driven by its own militaristic and imperial destiny, had conquered vast swaths of China and was poised to strike south, to create a new empire of its own. To the terrified, conquered millions, and even to the remaining free peoples of the world, the question was not if the Axis would win, but when. But this 1,000-year Reich and this co-prosperity sphere were, in reality, a house of cards. They were built not on a foundation of sound economics, sustainable logistics, or rational strategy, but on a dark, unstable core of ideological hatred, profound arrogance, and a self-destructive, almost mythical, belief in their own racial superiority. This core, their greatest perceived strength, was in fact their single greatest, and ultimately fatal, weakness. It was this ideological blindness that would lead them to make not one, but a series of catastrophic, irreversible errors. They would declare a war they could not possibly supply, against enemies they did not understand, and with a cruelty that would galvanize the entire world against them. The story of why the Axis lost is the story of this arrogance, and how it led, step by step, to their total, unconditional, and fiery collapse. The first, and perhaps most significant, crack in the fortress appeared in the skies over Great Britain in 1940. After conquering France, Hitler fully expected Britain to sue for peace. When they didn't, he ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the Royal Air Force, paving the way for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. The Luftwaffe, led by the arrogant Hermann Göring, believed it would be easy, but they failed. They were met by a new kind of enemy, a nation with its back to the wall, led by the defiant bulldog spirit of Winston Churchill, and most critically, armed with a new, secret weapon. This weapon was not a plane, it was an idea. It was radio detection and ranging radar. The British chain home system, a network of coastal towers, allowed the outnumbered RAF to see the German bombers coming, robbing them of the element of surprise. Göring, frustrated by the RAF's resilience, made a fatal mistake. He shifted his attacks from the critical RAF airfields and radar stations to a campaign of terror bombing London the Blitz. This gave the RAF the breathing room it needed to repair, rearm, and win the Battle of Britain. By failing to defeat this one, stubborn island, Hitler made his first great blunder. Britain was not just allowed to survive, it was allowed to thrive as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It became the vital, forward base for the American arsenal of democracy, the home of the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, and, years later, the indispensable staging ground for the D-Day landings. Hitler had left a mortal enemy at his back, and that enemy would, in time, become the dagger that pierced his Atlantic wall. The second, and most catastrophic, error was born of pure ideology. On June 22, 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was not a conventional war for territory. It was a Vernichtungsschrei, a war of annihilation. It was the physical manifestation of Hitler's Lebensraum, living space fantasy, a crusade to eradicate what he called Judeo-Bolshevism and enslave the subhuman Slavic peoples. He attacked with over 3 million men, the largest invasion force in history, and with absolute confidence, expecting a total victory in just 3 months. This single act, born of racial hatred, was the beginning of the end. It voluntarily opened a second, massive front that would ultimately consume the German army. The German High Command's planning for Barbarossa was based on their core racist belief that the Soviet soldier, being racially inferior, would collapse just as the French had. They were catastrophically wrong. They were met by two things they could not comprehend: the T-30 for tank and the Soviet soldier. The T-34, with its revolutionary sloped armor that deflected German shells, was a complete and terrifying shock, a machine superior to anything the Germans had. But even more shocking was the limitless, brutal resilience of the Red Army soldier. Fueled by Stalin's not one step back order and a deep, burning hatred for the German invaders, the Soviet soldier would die by the millions to defend the motherland. The Germans, who had planned for a short colonial war, now found themselves in a total war of attrition against a human ocean that was willing to trade 10 of its lives for one of theirs. Barbarossa was not just an ideological failure, it was a logistical suicide. The German army was a 19th century army with a 20th century armored spearhead. While the panzers raced ahead, the bulk of the army, over 2 million men, followed on foot, their supplies pulled by over 600,000 horses. They were not beaten by soldiers alone. They were beaten by distance. The sheer, horrifying, empty vastness of Russia swallowed their armies. Then came General Mud, the autumn rains that turned the unpaved roads into impassable quagmires. And finally, General Winter, a cold so profound it froze the oil in their engines, the grease in their rifles, and the flesh on their bones. By December 1941, the frozen, frost-bitten, and exhausted Wehrmacht was blood white at the gates of Moscow. The 3-month war was lost, and a 5-year nightmare had begun. As Germany was freezing to death in Russia, its Axis partner, Japan, made its own fatal gamble. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a brilliant, audacious, and profoundly foolish surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Driven by the need for oil, which the U.S. had embargoed, Japan's leaders believed they could deliver a knockout blow. They believed they could cripple the U.S. fleet, seize their new empire in Asia, and then force a shocked, soft America to negotiate for peace. It was a brilliant tactical strike, but it was a catastrophic strategic blunder. They didn't hit the American aircraft carriers, which were out at sea. They didn't hit the vital oil depots, and, most importantly, they had just awakened a 130 million person industrial giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. This is perhaps the most inexplicable and most critical reason for the Axis defeat. The attack on Pearl Harbor only brought America into a war with Japan. President Roosevelt faced a furious isolationist public and Congress, who demanded a Japan-first policy. He may have struggled to get a declaration of war against Germany, Japan's ally, but then, on December 11, 1941, just 4 days later, Adolf Hitler, in an act of staggering, inexplicable arrogance, stood before the Reichstag and formally declared war on the United States. He was not obligated to do this under the Tripartite Pact. He did it voluntarily. He saved Roosevelt the trouble of convincing Congress. He single-handedly signed his own death warrant, guaranteeing a two-front war against the world's two largest industrial and manpower superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the clock was ticking, and the Axis was doomed. The war was no longer just a fair fight between soldiers. It was a war of production, a war of logistics, a war of numbers, and the numbers were horrifying. The arsenal of democracy, American industry, safe from bombs and fueled by a capitalist economy, was unleashed. American factories produced more everything than the rest of the world combined. A B-24 bomber rolled off the assembly line at Willow Run every hour. A Liberty ship was built, from keel to launch, in a matter of days. For every German Tiger tank that was built, the Allies built 50 Shermans and T-34s. The war became an industrial avalanche. The German soldier, no matter how brave or well-trained, could not kill fast enough. He was, quite simply, about to be buried under a mountain of American steel. This industrial avalanche, however, was useless if it couldn't cross the ocean. Germany's last chance to win the war was in the cold, black waters of the North Atlantic. Admiral Dennitz's U-boat wolf packs were the one thing Churchill truly feared. If they could sever the river of steel from America to Britain and Russia, the Allies would starve, and the invasion of Europe would be impossible. But the U-boats failed. They were beaten by Allied mass production of destroyers and jeep carriers. They were beaten by new technologies like long-range bombers, sonar, and high-frequency direction finding. And, most critically, they were beaten by the war of minds. The Axis, built on an ideology of a master race, was intellectually outsmarted at every turn. At Bletchley Park, a secret campus of British mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions, led by the brilliant Alan Turing, achieved the impossible. They cracked the German unbreakable Enigma code. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, allowed the Allies to read Hitler's most secret orders. Often before his own generals did, they knew where the U-boats were. They knew Rommel's plans in Africa, and they knew Hitler's order of battle. Meanwhile, the Nazi Uranium Club, their atomic bomb program, faltered. It was crippled by infighting and, most profoundly, by Hitler's own racial science, which had driven the real geniuses Einstein, Fermi, Szilard, and Oppenheimer straight to America, where they built the Manhattan Project. The culmination of all these Axis failures, the failure to take Britain, the bleeding in Russia, the loss of the Atlantic, and the failure of intelligence led directly to June 6, 1944, D-Day. With ultra-intelligence, the Allies knew the German order of battle, with total air superiority. Won by American and British production, they controlled the skies, blinding the German army. With a secure base in Britain won in 1940, they had the staging ground, and with a brilliant deception plan, Operation Fortitude, they fooled Hitler into keeping his most powerful panzer divisions at Calais, waiting for a ghost army led by General Patton. The Atlantic Wall was breached, not by a single charge, but by a cascade of German failures that had begun for years earlier. Now, it was just a matter of time. The war became a race to Berlin. From the west, the Americans and British pushed through France. From the east, the Red Army, in a series of massive offensives, like Operation Bagration, annihilated German Army Group Center and tore the Eastern Front wide open. The Axis was now crushed between these two fronts. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, now unstoppable, reached its horrifying climax. The firebombing of cities like Dresden and Hamburg, and the B-29 raids on Tokyo, reduced the Axis homelands to rubble, a horrific reaping of the whirlwind that their own leaders had sown. The German wonder weapons, the Me-260 jets and V-2 rockets, were too little, too late. They were technological marvels that, in the end, changed nothing. The final verdict of history is clear. Why did the Axis lose? It was not one reason. It was a fatal, toxic combination of ideological blindness, profound arrogance, and logistical suicide. They were leaders who believed their own propaganda, who substituted willpower for fuel, and racial purity for industrial capacity. They declared war on everyone. They declared war on the endless manpower of the Soviet Union. They declared war on the stubborn resilience of Great Britain. And they declared war on the overwhelming industrial might of the United States. They declared war on morality and on science. In the end, the Axis did not just lose a war, they lost a war against the world. They were, in every sense, doomed from the start. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, hit the like button and subscribe for more daily content.